everybody, and welcome to Charts with Dan. I am back here in the studio in Los Angeles. Thank you for everybody who was very patient with me as I was broadcasting from my makeshift studio back in Arkansas while I was visiting some family. But I'm back here. We're back in the swing of things, more or less. And the box office is trying to get back into the swing of things because this was the date that was, well, I was going to say that we'd had on our calendars for months now, but it kind of kept getting moved. This was the final date that people were looking forward to when Tenet hit theaters everywhere. And I think that looking at the numbers, last week I'd said I would expect to see maybe around 3 times what we got with New Mutants. That is what we got. Let's see what happened at the box office with Tenet this weekend. As expected, it was the number one film. It'd be a big story if it wasn't, with $20.2 million. Now, this total is going to be updated. I was trying to bring the nearest totals that we had for the 4-day weekend. So the other films here had their 4-day totals updated, or at least estimated. I think this number is going to go up as the Monday totals for Tenet are added. But the number one film with $20.2 million, we're going to circle back to that number in just a minute. It had 7,000 per theater on a per theater average. That is more than double what New Mutants pulled in when it opened last week. There at number 2, $3.6 million is the New Mutants. It dropped a little under 60% for the 3-day weekend, not the 4-day weekend, but the 3-day weekend. So a bit of a steep drop for comparison. Unhinged dropped about 30% in its third week of release. Bill and Ted Face the Music dropped 40% in its second release, much like New Mutants. So even though Bill and Ted has a lower gross, percentage-wise, it dropped off less than New Mutants. I think, given the reviews and given the word of mouth, I think that shows that New Mutants is not going to have a extremely long legs, or perhaps not a lucrative long-lived time at the theater, although it's probably going to be in the top 5 for quite a while because, let's be honest, there's not much else out there right now. Bill and Ted Face the Music, as I mentioned there, at number 4, 809,000, a pretty good hold considering that it was also a hybrid VOD release, so plenty of people that are still choosing to go see Bill and Ted at either their indoor theaters or their local drive-ins, depending on what's open. And then the SpongeBob movie, Sponge on the Run, there at number 5, still bringing in movie just from Canada. That's the top 5 for the box office, and as we expected, Tenet was number 1. However, I want to dig into that $20.2 million number a little bit because it may not be exactly what it seems. And you can see that from an article that was written in Deadline that was actually the write-up about the box office for this weekend. And it answered a question that I had, and I know that some of you had, about this weekend's opening for Tenet. Let's take a look at that article. It said, Warner's opted for an 11-day opening, starting in Canada at the domestic box office, leading into Labor Day weekend and working up traffic with early previews this week. And then it goes on to say, it's a solid number when you come to think about it, and the best grosses we've seen from a movie to date during the pandemic, higher than the 10-day on Disney 20th Century Studios' New Mutants and Social Studios' Unhinged, which has been in release for 4 weeks. And yes, that is true. It is higher than the 10-day total for New Mutants and for Unhinged. However, those are not equivalent movies, definitely not equivalent budgets and not equivalent projects. And this answers a question that I had when it comes to the release of Tenet. We already knew that Canada's opening weekend for Tenet last weekend was going to be rolled into the domestic opening weekend numbers when they were reporting numbers for this weekend. Canada is a part of the domestic reporting for any film, so that's not necessarily unusual, although part of that $20.2 million actually came in from Canada last weekend. Also, Tenet had several early access screenings. As a matter of fact, in places where theaters were open, it was pretty much like the movie had been released at the same number of showtimes, the same number of theaters. So not only are we looking at this $20.2 million number, and again, that's going to go up slightly when today's figures are factored into that, we're not only looking at Canada's release total from last weekend, we're looking at a release total going back to this previous Monday, and the first 3 days, soon to be 4 days of release domestically. So that $20.2 million is great, but you should not look at that as a 3-day opening weekend number. That is more like, as the Deadline article states, a 10-day gross. And I do think that that might put the brakes a little bit on the idea that Tenet completely resuscitated box office movie going here in the United States particularly. Now, a big part of it is the fact that theaters in New York City, theaters in Los Angeles, theaters in a lot of major cities are not open yet. And the fact that Warner Brothers did not allow Tenet to play at drive-ins in those cities where indoor theaters were closed. I said that was a stupid idea when we talked about it a couple weeks ago. I still think it was a stupid idea because the fact of the matter remains, I think that the Tenet number would be significantly higher if it had been allowed to play at drive-in theaters where indoor movie theaters were closed. Those drive-in theater screenings would have been packed as they can be, given the restrictions, if Tenet had been allowed to play there. So we would have seen a much bigger opening. You would have had a market availability in places where you could not get that availability because theaters were closed. And if I'm being honest, I think it's starting to build resentment against the movie. I've seen a lot of my friends who were very excited to see this. This is not scientific, by the way, but I've seen a lot of my friends who were very excited to see this movie here. And now at the point, it's like, you know what? Screw it. I really do think that they are starting to alienate people by being so precious about which theaters can show it and which theaters can't, especially because we're at a stage where we don't know when theaters are going to be open in certain places. So they have obviously staked their claim to the long release pattern for this movie. They want Tenet to play over many, many, many weeks, and they obviously want to wait for those theaters in Los Angeles and New York, etc., to open because that's where they want people to go see the movie. But given the numbers that we're seeing right now, while it's a nice number, it's over $20 million, that's great. That doesn't, to me, show from the places where people could go see Tenet a huge rush of enthusiasm, like unabated enthusiasm to go see the movie. So this idea that Tenet was going to be the movie that everybody went out to go see, I don't think we're seeing that from the theaters that are open. I think that we might be seeing a backlash from people who are being asked to wait because Warner Brothers won't play it at the drive-in. And there's something else that I saw that kind of, I gotta say, pissed me off a little bit. And I didn't know this. This was kind of buried in this same Deadline article that I was discussing. But in doing the research, I have seen this reported elsewhere about Tenet going back a few weeks as we were building up to the release. This is from the Deadline article. Tenet played in IMAX, Dolby, and motion seats. The movie is playing on a majority of screens at the average multiplex. Some independent chains, we're told, are being charged a 63% rental by the studio, and that's for the entire run of the Nolan movie, which is expected to be 12 weeks, 3 months basically. And I have to say, if this is true, if this reporting is accurate, and Warner Brothers is not only holding back Tenet from drive-in theaters, but for the theaters that are playing the movie, if they're asking for a 63% rental, what that basically means is that for every dollar that's brought into a movie theater, Warner Brothers gets 63 cents of that dollar back, and the movie theater gets to keep 37 cents. Now, we've talked about the release structure on the show before, and it's not uncommon for a theater to ask for a price structure like this for an opening weekend. Disney, for example, has notoriously been heavy-handed when it comes to asking for a big percentage of the opening weekend, 70% in some cases, depending on different reports. So the 63% number for the opening weekend is not unusual. But for Warner Brothers, if this is true, to ask for 63% of the gross from this movie for the entire run, when they know that they are going to be the only movie in theaters, at least for the next month, they're going to be the big draw in theaters for a very long time, and their stated goal is to play this movie for several months and get people to come and see it, then I'm sorry, and put your earmuffs on if you're one of the young kids watching. But this whole narrative about this movie saving theatrical exhibition is 100% bullshit. At least on the Warner Brothers side. I don't doubt that Christopher Nolan himself is very devoted to saving the theatrical experience, but this is obvious. If the studio wants 63% of the entire take of this movie, that is very detrimental to movie theaters, who this is their only option. This is the only movie they can play. They're hurting after a summer of being completely shut down. And now you have a studio coming to them and saying, if you want my movie, by the way, the only movie, you're giving me 63%, not just on the first weekend, but for the entire run of the movie. Then this is not about saving the theatrical experience. This is about Warner Brothers wanting to make as much money as they can, which, huge surprise, they're a multinational conglomerate. Of course that's what they want to do. But stop it then with this idea that you're doing the film goers, the film-loving public of the world a service by gracing us with Tenet. You're just trying to make as much money as you can and cut your losses, which, it's a pandemic. You lost a bunch of money. I get it. But don't play it as if you're doing some public service for movie lovers everywhere, because you're not. not at those kinds of margins, and not for the entire theatrical run of the movie. If you want to charge that kind of thing, fine, but you can't play it off as if you're coming in to save theatrical exhibition on one hand, while with the other hand, you're twisting their arm behind their back to make sure that they play your movie. That doesn't jibe with me. You can't play both sides. So now we turn our attention to the road forward for Tenet. As I mentioned, Warner Brothers' plan is to have this movie play out over several months, to roll into theaters as they open, and to try to make back the money that they need to make on a very long run thing. So you're not basing it on opening weekend, you're basing it on kind of how movies used to be released, which is you have a platform release, word of mouth spreads, people go see it when they're able to. That's the way that the industry worked for decades. Now we've moved away from that now in the era of the big blockbuster, but this is what Warner Brothers wants to do. However, there was other thing that caught my attention this weekend, and I've done a video on this before when I was back at Fandom Entertainment. I did something about Cinemascore. Cinemascore is a service that basically surveys moviegoers in select markets on opening night of different films to get their thoughts on a movie. They give it a letter grade, and then that's reported as basically the audience reaction. And if you want to go check out that video, you can. I'll put a link to it down in the description below. But basically, it's not necessarily a critical tool as far as like this movie's good or this movie's bad, because there's plenty of great movies that have bad cinema scores, and there's plenty of terrible movies that have good cinema scores. It's based on what audiences expected and what they got on opening night. Cinemascore actually ran a survey for Tenet, and the results were kind of surprising. Let's look at how it fell in the Christopher Nolan filmography. Now, it is based on wide releases, so you're not going to see Following in here, and you're not going to see Memento on here because those were smaller releases. But the other Nolan films are on here. As you can see, the Dark Knight trilogy, Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, and The Dark Knight Rises all got an A Cinemascore. Opening night audiences got what they wanted. They enjoyed it. Then you see Dunkirk there with an A-. Inception got a B+. Interstellar got a B+. Those are two kind of heady movies, so you can see how audiences perhaps were going in for an action film or a straight-up sci-fi movie and were a little mixed on what they got. Then you have, at the B Cinemascore, you have Insomnia, you have The Prestige, and you have Tenet. Two early films in Christopher Nolan's filmography, and then the latest film in Christopher Nolan's filmography, at a time when I think most audiences, at least if you're going on opening night, might know what to expect from a Nolan movie. So usually when we look at these scores, the waterline for kind of sounding the alarm bells is a B-. If you get a B- or below, that's where you start. If you're a studio, you're saying, okay, something's not clicking with audiences here. So Tenet getting a B is not necessarily a terrible thing, but obviously you'd want it up there like an A- like Dunkirk, obviously an A or an A+. A B does indicate that the people that did go see the movie were a little mixed on what they saw. Now, generally, if it's opening weekend in the traditional sense, if you get something like a B, then you don't necessarily have to worry about it that much because you've gotten a big chunk of change there on opening weekend. Not necessarily the case with Tenet. Tenet wants to play a very long game here. The thing that is often informed by Cinemascore is what we call the multiplier. The multiplier is how much a movie makes based on its opening weekend. So, for example, if a movie makes $100 million on its opening weekend, and it ends up with a final gross of $300 million domestic, then we say it has a 3 times multiplier. It made 3 times what its opening weekend gross was. Let's look at those multipliers on the same films based on their cinema score. Now, Batman Begins had a 4.21 multiplier. That means it made 4.2 times what its opening weekend gross was. Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises, their multipliers are actually pretty low when you look at Nolan's filmography, but it kind of makes sense in the context of knowing that both of those movies had huge openings. And so you see that a lot. The multipliers are lower on some films with great grades because their openings were massive. So that isn't necessarily an indication of quality. Then you see with Dunkirk, 3.76 times its multiplier. Inception did great, that B+. I think Inception probably, as a matter of fact, the best multiplier of Christopher Nolan's career, despite kind of being in the middle on his cinema scores. I think that's because Inception was a movie that a lot of people reacted very strongly to in a positive way, and that some people, particularly with the ending, probably walked out of going, oh, what was that? So you see that disparity there, but that's a movie that really did connect with audiences in a general sense. Interstellar had a 3.96 multiplier. I think it's the same deal with Inception. You had a very polarizing film. And then you look at Insomnia and The Prestige with B cinema scores. Other than The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises with their huge openings, Insomnia and The Prestige both opened a little bit closer to what we might see with Tenet, where they're not getting all their money in their opening weekend. They had 3.2 times and 3.59 times their opening weekends with that B cinema score. So obviously all bets are off when we talk about how this movie performs, because those are not comparisons that are one-to-one comparisons. Obviously, that's during regular movie-going times. That's when all theaters are open. That's when more movies are coming out. However, I think what it does show is that Warner's strategy with the long play for Tenet is a little dicey compared to audience response. We've had critical response in the 70s, the upper 70s, which isn't terrible, but it's not a rave. Those aren't rave reviews. Another metric to look at is the audience response on Rotten Tomatoes. Now, they again, this is not a black and white metric as to how a movie is done, but when you look at the verified ratings right now, Tenet is currently Christopher Nolan's second worst audience rating when you look at Rotten Tomatoes. It's at 78%. It's 1% above his lowest audience rating for any movie that he's done, which would be Insomnia at 77%. Again, I'm not saying that means it's a bad movie. What I am saying is that critical response has been a little mixed. Audience response, if you take the cinema score, the B cinema score, and the audience ratings that we're seeing on Rotten Tomatoes, is not necessarily ecstatic. And I think if you're Warner Brothers, that's what you would want with this kind of strategy. When you're counting on a movie to play over a set number of weeks because there are smaller theaters, or you want people to be really thirsting for that movie when it comes, when your theaters open up in your market, you want to get there and see it as soon as you can. A mixed response isn't necessarily what you want. So when we're looking at Tenet and we're looking at Tenet domestically, there's no apples to apples comparisons. We are in unprecedented times. However, it is going to be interesting to see what it does each week, particularly if these major market theaters open in New York and Los Angeles. Let's say in 6 weeks, Los Angeles opens. Are we going to see a big rush to go see Tenet? Or by that time, will the people that really wanted to have gone to see it, gone to, if we're in Los Angeles, gone to Las Vegas or gone to San Diego or gone to where they need to go to see it, and the rest of the people, given the reaction, said, you know what, I'll wait. We'll see, because I don't think that's what Warner Brothers wants. Warner Brothers, I think, wants this to be the must-see movie event of the summer, and it may turn out that they don't quite have that. So the real question is going to be, what does the road ahead look like? Another update that we have, of course, Tenet is playing in several markets worldwide. As a matter of fact, it opened up in China to about $30 million this past weekend. That's Christopher Nolan's best opening weekend in China. It was in second place behind the 800, which is a huge hit in China right now. So we will check and see how it does in China. Christopher Nolan's movies generally tend to be, as we call them, leggy. They play out a little bit longer, pretty much worldwide. So we'll continue to see how Tenet does in China. Obviously, Warner Brothers would love a big number there as well to bolster what it's doing here domestically. But we also are starting to get some updated numbers for what the 2020 worldwide box office actually looks like. So this is the biggest revision I've done to this chart since April when I started this show. Let's look at the 2020 box office as it stands right now. Bad Boys for Life is still the number one movie of the year with $424 million, but the 800 is still closing in on it pretty fast. It's now number 2. Sonic the Hedgehog is at number 3. It drops down a spot. Then we have Dolittle and Birds of Prey hanging in at number 4 and number 5. Tenet is making a play to break into the top 5. Its combined gross now from its opening weekend here in the United States, from its opening in China, from its opening everywhere around the world thus far is $146.2 million. If you're Warner Brothers, you want that gross to keep going up because Tenet has a big budget. You want to get to at least, I think, about $400 million total for Tenet. And that's where you start going like, they really want that number to keep climbing. It may very well do that. It may very well do that because this is a long play for Tenet. We'll see where it winds up. That drops The Invisible Man down one spot. Then Onward, actually, once you total in what it's done after the market shut down, Onward actually jumps up one spot there to number 8 over The Gentleman, and The Call of the Wild is there at number 10. So we're still, I think this is the first time this year where all 10 of those worldwide movies have been over $100 million. So, baby steps, I guess. But there's still a long way to go. And obviously with Tenet, it is the long game for Warner Brothers. We'll see if that long game plays off. I don't really know if there is a right or a wrong way to have done what they did in Tenet, other than not doing the drive-in thing, which I think was definitely the wrong way. But as far as overall release strategy, you can sit in Monday Morning Quarterback all day long if you want to. That's what people are certainly doing with Mulan, which we'll talk about here in a second. But we will see how Tenet does over the rest of the year, honestly, and see if it keeps climbing up that worldwide chart. Speaking of Mulan, as I did just a moment ago, this Friday, Mulan opens in China. Disney obviously wanting a big number for Mulan in China because it is the biggest theatrical market that it's opening in, because everywhere that has Disney Plus is going to see it on Disney Plus. It's available now in most of those markets. It will be free in December, but you can buy it premiere early access for right now for $30 on Disney Plus. However, obviously, because of its roots in Chinese folklore, Mulan is going to be, hopefully for Disney, a big draw in China. Now, there has been controversy following this film for months now, before this pandemic even started. There has been, and I will continue to recommend Gavin Feng on Twitter for fantastic Chinese box office coverage. Generally, if I need to know what's going on in China, Gavin's got what's going on. But there have already been reportedly, leading up to the release of Mulan, some very mixed feelings amongst the Chinese public about this movie. So we will see what happens in China with Mulan. Mulan famously, even though the market was very different then than it is now, night and day different, but the animated version of Mulan did nothing in China. And generally Chinese audiences, if they feel as if they're being pandered to, or if they just feel as if this is not something that is culturally respectful or culturally accurate, they will reject things like Mulan outright. That would be a nightmare scenario for Disney, obviously, because they want Mulan to make a bunch of money in China, because they need a bunch of money everywhere else but Disney Plus. We're not going to know how that Disney Plus thing went, because unless Disney decides to release those numbers, they may not. We may have to wait till earnings calls and stock and all that stuff that they have to disclose. Again, with Mulan, a bit of a mixed reaction based on audience response. Critical response generally positive. I wasn't a huge fan, but many other people were. So we'll see what happens with Mulan. A big signpost is going to be this upcoming weekend as we see the numbers coming from China and see what the Chinese audience thinks of this film. So let's go from the world to what people are watching in their homes, because a lot of people are still watching stuff on streaming, and I just kind of like to see how these patterns work out. So let's see, first of all, what people are watching on their Amazon accounts. Number one, and by the way, all of these movies that I'm going to describe to you today are my favorite group of movie descriptions ever. Number one is a movie called Guest House, which stars Pauly Shore, Steve-O, Billy Zane, and Lou Ferrigno, amongst others. That's the cast of the year, right? Then you have Bill and Ted Face the Music, Black Panther, and Rogue carrying over from last week. The Karate Kid, 1984 is The Karate Kid. I think this is the Cobra Kai effect. Cobra Kai Cobra Kai went from YouTube to Netflix this past week, so I think a lot of people are going back and revisiting The Karate Kid. Then we have The King of Staten Island and Trolls World Tour. Spectre there at number 8. People may be starting to ramp up. There's a new James Bond trailer that came out last week, so I think people are probably revisiting the last James Bond movie. Then we have The Silencing and John Wick Chapter 3 there at number 10. Let's go over to iTunes and see what people are watching on their Apple devices, Apple TV, on their phones, although please don't watch movies on your phone. I get it, but come on. Number one is The Second. The Second is an action movie starring Ryan Phillippe and Casper Van Dien as the bad guy. So you've got that going on. Irresistible opening up its rental window. That's a movie from Jon Stewart that came out earlier this year. Bill and Ted Face the Music and The King of Staten Island there at number 3 and 4. Robin's Wish, which is a documentary about Robin Williams that I've heard is great. I haven't had a chance to see it. They're at number 5. The Harry Potter Complete Collection. The potheads are out in full force. They're enjoying their Harry Potter films at number 6. Then some holdovers, The Silencing, Bill and Ted's Triple Feature, and 42 at 7, 8, and 9. And then we have Guest House there at number 10 on the iTunes chart. So it's on 2 different charts. Somebody's watching it. I don't know. I mean, look at that cast. How could you not, right? And let's see the top 10 over on Netflix. Love Guaranteed is the number 1 movie. It's a new Netflix original that came out just this week. That stars Rachel Lee Cook and Damon Wayans Jr., and it is directed by Daredevil writer-director Mark Steven Johnson. So, ba-bum, there you go. A Due Date at number 2, followed by The Smurfs, Anaconda, and Puss in Boots. By the way, this is one of the rare fully, beginning of the year, I guess, because Netflix switches things out on the first of the month. Things go on, things go off. A full turnover on the Netflix charts. All 10 spots. Mark your calendars. It's a momentous day. So Anaconda, Puss in Boots there at number 4. and number 5. Freaks, You're One of Us is a German superhero film about a fry cook who has superpowers. That's at number 6. I'm Thinking of Ending Things, which is the newest film from Charlie Kaufman. I'm thinking of watching it. I haven't had a chance to see it yet. Then we have Adrift, theatrical release from a couple years ago. Then Boss Baby, Get That Baby, which is an interactive Boss Baby adventure that will place you at your ideal job at Baby Corp. So if you've ever wanted to know what role you would have at Baby Corp, play Boss Baby, Get That Baby at number 9. And then Red Dragon, the prequel to Silence of the Lambs and Hannibal, starring Anthony Hopkins and Edward Norton, they're at number 10. So a lot of people checking out some new stuff on Netflix because all the other stuff, Project Power, all the stuff we've been looking at, it's gone. People want what's new, what's new, what's going on. So that's all I got for this week on Charts with Dan. It'll be very interesting to see what Tenet does in the weeks ahead. Have you seen it? Do you plan to see it? Are you going to wait? I've seen people across the spectrum saying that they're going to do all of it. Let me know down in the comments below. And please don't forget to check me out over on Patreon, patreon.com/Dan Murrell. We are rolling out a whole bunch of new features this month, including a live watch along, an extra commentary for those that are at my director tier, Schmodown study sessions, Schmodown commentary tracks, all kinds of fun stuff. You can check that out over on Patreon. I'd love to have you come join the film crew there. And you can check me out on Twitter and Instagram at MurrellDan. Thank you so much for watching the show. We'll be back next week with even more numbers, and stay tuned here on the channel for the latest news, movie reviews, charts, you name it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.